Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Last time we had started on that which nullifies the salah. Uh, in the video captured to about number 5, there's a list of about 30, and this text is roughly about 25 in the more relied upon texts like Khalil and so on and so forth. But of course, the topic itself is probably one of the most key or important topics within the context of the fiqh of the salah or understanding the salah, and also its rulings and the different aspects of the salah itself. So each section that is presented, the part of the importance of the the Turathi books. I want to move away from using the word tradition, but Turath is those books which, the inherited knowledge from the scholars of the past. In the particular period in which the Mukhtasar or the primer system arises, the philosophy behind it is is basically to kind of have like cliff notes, um, meaning, to be able to simply access knowledge, uh, what's essential from it, and do it at an instant, right? And so that was part of the whole reality of memorizing a text, and so that varied in terms of how the text was written, in terms of what was to be memorized. It varied in style and in content, but the idea is, regardless of whether you're studying a lower level text or intermediate text or an advanced text, one thing to always keep in mind is the framework of the text. More, like I said, here's 30 points that mention what invalidates the salah. You need, but when you start looking at other texts, you're gonna find a different number, right? That's all that has to do with the contents. It's a detailed point. But the idea of saying that the salah, there is within the discussion on the salah a section of knowledge which just focuses on that which invalidates it. Now, that's a different conversation, because you start off with what are the essentials or cornerstones or obligations of the salah? What are the sunnah of the salah? Then, it goes into the whole concept of understanding that there's a priority of obligations, right? That not everything is at the level of wajib or obligation that must be performed. Some obligations are encouraged, and that doesn't make sense except with the language. The language in general, you're going to find that is either command or prohibition. That's the that's the language. But then when you go in detail and you look at the proofs of the Quran and Sunnah, the language may be altered from being a command or a prohibition to being an encouragement or to being a discouragement or just to being permissible. Those are the five ahkam that we, as the majority, meaning the Malikis, the Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, we as the majority, we go by the five ruling system, five values, values to action, right? The values being whether something is a in the act of necessity and obligation in Sharia, or whether it's that which is prohibited in the extreme, or that which is disliked, distasteful, comes close to being prohibited, or that which is encouraged, right? So that's something to always think about. The language itself is command or prohibition. The nuance, what changes something from being an obligation to recommendation, it has to do with a shift in the language and the evidence. Is something showing that this is no longer an obligation. Usually, what happens is you have a strong encouragement with no punishment attached to it, or a strong encouragement with a punishment attached to it. That's kind of the marker, meaning that if you have a prohibition, right, in the case of the opposite side of things, you have a discouragement, you have a prohibition, you have a strong discouragement and a punishment attached to it. That is what you call the haram. There's a clear punishment attached to doing it. And you're highly pushed away from not doing it. If you have a discouragement, which it looks strong, but there's no punishment attached to it, that's where you get the makruh or the disliked. If you have a strong encouragement towards an action within the realm of commands, not prohibitions, we covered the prohibition side of it. We said that the strong discouragement with an attached punishment is haram. Discouragement with no punishment attached to it is makruh. On the other side, strong encouragement with the reward for doing it and punishment for not doing it, that's the wajib. And then if you just have reward for doing it with no punishment, then that's when you get into the things like the mandub and the sunnah and the mustahab. All of those pretty much are synonymous for simplicity's sake. And then you have some actions which the ruling can change, but the core of it is that it's permissible unless otherwise noted. So that priority of values, where you begin to kind of look at actions and you categorize them on the scale of do, don't do, based on punishment reward. That gives you a system for how you work with actions, how you know the morality or the ethics behind the action. Is it pleasing to Allah? Is not pleasing to Allah. But when it comes to the fiqh of the salah, it starts off with what is an obligation, what must be done, what is fard, what is wajib. For the most part, those terms are synonymous. And then it moves into the lesser degree of what is desirable, right? And it could come with some strong discouragement. It could come with, from the angle that sunan muakkada are things which are practiced with regularity and frequency by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at least in the thinking of the scholars. But they're not an obligation. The obligations are part of the sunnah too, but they're practiced, just as that. They're practiced as things which can't be left off. right? And then you get to the point where you have the you have that which is encouraged, right? In this book we dealt with the mandubat, and then you get into that which is discouraged, which is the makruhat. Those things are disliked, and then now we get into the issue of that which nullifies. So for each section, you have to think about what makes up that section of knowledge. When you like at this point, this completes the basic cycle of study, and then you know what comes after this section is how do you correct mistakes? How do you correct mistakes? But the basic cycle of study is that which is an obligation, that which is a sunnah, that which is recommended, that which is disliked, and that which nullifies the salah. So for those sections, you should have a conceptualization of what is going on under that title. When we talk about what nullifies, you should know what nullify means. You should know what we're talking about in terms of that section of knowledge. That's the whole purpose of the primer. The primer is there to help to conceptualize the mukhtasar, to help you conceptualize in a short way, in an easy way, the knowledge which you need to know, and in this case, in order to carry out the salah properly, right? So it's not just the issue of just going through the book, it's the issue of understanding the logic behind it, right? And the logic in each section is that you have certain key ideas with regard to this salah, and then for each key idea, there's detailed points. We know the salah is composed of obligations that constitutes the cornerstones of the salah. Okay, what are they? We know that the salah, that the obligations are complemented by the sunan. And we know that there's a slight difference between the sunan and the obligations. But continued non-performance, creates a deficiency in the salah, right? So then the question comes up, does it nullify? Does it not nullify? Well, that's the issue that comes up. What nullifies the salah are those things which take it out of its form. Those things which take it out of its form, right? And so those things which take it out of its form are what is being mentioned. When it comes to the section that comes after this, the sajda sahu, the prostration of absent-mindedness or being distracted, you know, in terms of not giving the salah is right. That only pertains to the sunan al-muakkadat, those higher classified sunan. So the fiqh of priorities, understanding priorities becomes essential. This is, as we mentioned, one of the unique characteristics of where knowledge went. in the later days among the scholars. Shah Waliullah mentioned that this type of classification and organization was not there in the time of the Sahaba to the extent that we see it. The core was there, the foundation was there, but the detailing points that came about later on among the scholars in these types of books, that's a development which was not there early on. That's what happened with the Salafi Dawah. The Salafi Dawah, a lot of the detailed points in fiqh, people were not teaching that. They were just pushing concept, which is exactly what the Sahaba did, to be honest with you, to be fair. But the Sahaba did it in a more controlled way where there were people that were actually in charge of teaching, and so you didn't have the chaos, right? So there's some deficiencies in terms of method of how fiqh came into this country was under that group, the Salafi orientation, right? When it comes to the madhabs, we'll see that in the next section, how the problem of multiple opinions, sometimes has to be worked out when it comes to madhabi fiqh. You know, historically, what has been dominant has been the Hanafi madhab in the U.S. Right? And then you started to see the sparkling of other madhab. The first madhab probably was the Maliki school, because we know that in the Americas, the the Jama'ah of Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi was brought into the Americas. The group, the followers, the scholars of Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio's group were brought into the Americas, and there's documented evidence that shows that the Risala of Abi Zayd was in these areas. But as far as consistency and so on and so forth, the Hanafi madhab has been here. The preference at times of the Fiqh Council on terms of economics, Amja, and so on and so forth, at one point in time was heavily Hanbali, some of the scholars being Shafi'i, but it was heavily Hanbali. And as mentioned before, the Masajid, many of them went neutral in terms of the madhabs because of the necessity to integrate various peoples into the masjid space, right? So when you had high diversity, you began to see kind of a madhab neutral space, right? The madhabs didn't become an obstacle to Muslims interacting with each other. Because that comes up, why do you practice like this? Why do you do this? I mean, those discussions were intense for a while, right? Within the context of Muslim American space. And some masajid already had it set up and people had control, and it was one dominant group in control. So it was just that's how they do. They just do that and that's how they do it. And it was kind of known uh, to be the case. So here we're conceptualizing the section on what nullifies the prayer. I said all that to kind of, tie that
Sure,
into this.
Joseph.
Yes.
I'm sorry I'm late. The time difference threw me off, so I messed up on that. But I was gonna ask you, how do you deal with the people who are like bullying you to follow a madhab. Like you have to. And if you're not, then you are outside of the folds of Islam. Or like if you respect all the madhabs, like how do you deal with the people who are like hyper aggressive about it? Because it's like you look at them and you're like, well, how are you arguing about religion? Religion is supposed to make you a better person. So like how are you arguing about this stuff and threatening people if you're trying to do it for the, if you're doing it for the sake of Allah?
The issue of not following a madhab, there's no evidence to say that following a madhab is an obligation. That has nothing to do with the Salafi da'wah. That has to do with usul al-fiqh. But what the obligation is to follow scholarship. So then the issue comes up that the default position has been to follow the madhab. So then the question comes, how do you follow the madhab then? Right? When you have multiple madhab. And there's been debates, can you borrow from, can you take from this madhab and that madhab? And for a long time, Al-Azhar al-Sharif has left it as, that is up to the follower, right? Um, and part of that is years of experience. Al-Azhar has all of the madhabs in it. And Al-Azhar has been a defender of, let's say, what some like to call the traditional orientation. I hate the term, but for the sake of simplicity, I say it. And I mentioned that, it's not a good term. Because the English language has to be, we have to advance how we talk about Islam in English, and it's still some issues that come up in our lack of language. So that has been not something that Al Azhar innovated in Islamic knowledge, but that has been the standing in usul al-fiqh. And in that regard, Sheikh Tantawi, who was the former Sheikh Al Azhar, he wrote a book which was very similar to Fiqh Sunnah, but much more organized. And he merged the basic texts for the four madhabs into one book. And then he used, like, he facilitated modern language. Some scholars were at an uproar because of that. I had a teacher who was a student of Sheikh Abdul Halim Mahmoud, Sheikh Abdul Hamid, rahmatullahi alayhima. And he used to teach Arabic for free in a masjid at a high level and at a low level. He taught poetry and he taught grammar for free. He was a Zahid, person that did without in the dunya. He used to always wear one thobe, sometimes even had holes in it, and refused to have. I even offered to buy him a thobe. He refused. He would eat little, so on and so forth. So he was mentioning that the scholars sometimes are not practical. The students come, they don't understand these texts because they're written in another time period. And it takes a lot to decode. So he was saying, يعني هذا كان عمل محمود. It was like a praiseworthy effort on the part of Sheikh Tantawi rahmatullahi alayh. And I saw the book. I have a copy somewhere in my library. It's we were taught from some of it, and it's true. It's true. The facilities there. So the point being is like the styles of writing and so on and so forth facilitate learning. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that's part of the dilemma that some of these brothers that they go to study, they're not into the philosophy of education. Many of them are not. They're just duplicating whatever it is that's being done by their teachers, and their teachers may not be at that level of understanding how to transmit knowledge to an illiterate ummah. The teachers are more focused on an environment in which, there's just a certain level of literacy and things operate in a certain way, and that's it. And that's part of the dilemma. But within the context of madhab expertise, that's not the approach. And anybody can say whatever they want. You know what I'm saying in that regard. I studied with Nasser Farid Wasil, who was the Mufti of Egypt and Mujtahid in the Shafi madhab. New other madhab. I studied with Sheikh Ali Juma. You know what I'm saying? And people can say, oh, but these are Salafi approach. Sheikh Ali Juma is a hardcore anti-Salafist at this point in time. Even with Sheikh Ahmed Tahir Rayan, who was against the book that was written by Sheikh Tantawi, you will never hear that concept of it. There's just an encouragement. They encourage because they understand the benefit, but they don't force like that, like the way that ignorant people do. And it's the same thing in Aqidah, the same thing. You know what I'm saying? Like this level of force that you see and so on and so forth, that's not what the real scholars do. Real scholars don't have that orientation, right? So there's no obligation to follow a madhab, right? But what happens is now when you start talking about understanding Islam, the whole question comes up in terms of practice. Can you follow something outside? And that's a huge debate. Huge debate. You know what I'm saying? With varying opinions. With varying opinions. So then it becomes that your fatwa has to be within the four schools of thought, that type of concept among some of them. And then some of them are like, no, you know what I'm saying? Scholarship has the right of research and ijtihad. So either way, what people can't really deviate from without falling into serious issues at the scholarly level is the issue of following usul al-fiqh. The madhabs are just a byproduct of the application of usul al-fiqh. Now, for the average Muslim, you go with what's easy. You don't have to you don't have to follow a madhab with, with stricture, but it organizes your knowledge, meaning that you don't have to just follow one thing and that's it. No, it just organizes your knowledge. The madhab organizes your knowledge. Is a safe way to organize your knowledge. And at this level, at the level of, for the most part, at the level of the arkan, with the exception of some masail, it's not a big deal. In other words, the issue of time and place and changes in society, it's not going to affect too much. So if you learned your fiqh from this like a madhab-based book, the argument of time and place is not super strong. The argument of time and place, changes in society comes up on certain issues. Like, for instance, the requirement to have a masjid in a community for Juma. For instance, how you deal with zakat. Do you give it in grain or do you give it in money? Or the issue of the moon sighting. Can you use calculation? Yeah, or can you go by one sighting throughout the whole of the world, or do you have to have a local sighting? Can the knowledge be transmitted by way of email or text or TV? Those are contemporary issues that pertain to the basics of the deen, the arkan. The same with Hajj. Sometimes we read certain rulings in the fiqh of Hajj, but then when we go to Mecca, Medina, the government of Saudi Arabia has projects going on, or they have imposed certain rules for safety concerns or for some other infrastructural rationale. And it requires of us to kind of think through how it is that we're dealing with the rules of Hajj, or even the concept of visitation, right? People don't like it, but they say, oh, the government of Saudi Arabia is, which I'm not necessarily, I'm not a fanboy at all. But, I've seen certain things there, like, so they'll say the government of Saudi Arabia, they prohibit us from going to the um the grave of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, when you have, the logistical issues of a million people, going to Hajj, can everyone stop and do whatever they want to do and safety be maintained? There was a complaint at one period of time of the amount of people that were dying at Hajj. So those things, they alternate. But the core, again, there should be no confusion on this, that the madhab is a scholarly path. There should be no confusion on the benefit of the madhab. Now, the idea that you just have to follow this one thing and that's it and you're a kafir. No, nobody says that except a person of ignorance. I hate to say it, but that is an ignorant statement.
Yeah.
Takfir with regard to ijtihad is very problematic. You know what I'm saying? And that's why Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi says, no, you're not obligated to follow we read that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go back to the, he said, him and Sharani, you're obligated to follow Quran and Sunnah. The ijtihadat of the ulama, you're not obligated to that. It just facilitates. And that's a technical point that may not be clear and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the issue of making takfir on somebody, taking them outside of Islam, that's something that has to be brought up, because that type of personality or that type of mentality, you know, it has to be curbed. It has to be curbed, where we have to have a little more tolerance. And this is why Imam Sharani wrote on these issues, because in his time period, there was so much conflict between the madhab.
Mm-hmm.
So he tried to create an environment of tolerance among the madhab followers. And with the mentality that we have now, we will very much go right to that space, right? Because we have a lot of bigotry. Yeah, we have a lot of bigotry in the way that people are being taught to practice. So following the method has its benefit, no doubt. But if somebody doesn't follow a method, they're kafir. No, I mean, the issue comes up is, how do you acquire your knowledge? That's the whole question, and that's why people would say, well, the default position is going right back to the method. That's the argument that they try to make in that regard. But no, I argue the opposite and say, well, look, there's other books that have been written in the non-madhabi form as well, whether it's fiqh sunnah or whether it's what's it called? The book of Abu Bakr al-Jazairi. Um, Minhaj al-Muslim, called Minhaj al-Muslim, right? All that stuff is translated to English. There's other books as well. And to be frank with you, Minhaj al-Muslim, uh, Fiqh according to the Quran and the Sunnah, by Subhi Halaq. I'll be honest with you that those books have way much more access to evidence than majority of the stuff that's written in Madhabi Fiqh at the level that we have. The only book that I would say that kind of takes it to another level is Fiqh al-Minhaji, which is written in Shafi Fiqh. And the only thing that we have of that is volume one and the five pillars of Islam. Five pillars of Islam, which is predominantly Hanafi fiqh, but Mullah Ali Qari included the other madahib in their evidences. And then you have Dr. Hatim al-Hajj's book, Al-Umda. Those
Mhm.
books in madhabi fiqh, they are unique because they're teaching you the underlying rationale and evidence for the ruling, right? So it shouldn't be confused, in that regard. To clarify, it's like it's encouraged to study systematically, and the madhabi approach and the non-madhabi approach are there. You know what I'm saying? Systematically, which is different. It means still following scholars. You know what I'm saying? Is there. One way is, there's scholarship that's done in that regard. And when people bring opposite of that, يعني أنا أستغرب من هذا القول. It's always surprising, and part of the reason why is sitting with the scholars of Al Azhar and being in that environment and being with students and being with professors, being with mashaykh, because those are two different environments. The university environment is one environment, and the masjid halaqa study circle environment is another environment. The- Sometimes the discourses are a little bit different, but that's not that's just not the way. Like that type of language is not used except someone that's considered ignorant.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I don't care if it's an imam or a scholar that's saying that or whatever. That's just not the way in the circles of knowledge, except in some sort of environment where it's just one thing, where that's all that they're learning, where it's super ideological. You know what I'm saying? And that's what they're imposing. And unfortunately, majority of the Muslim world is like that. Majority of the Muslim world is like that. But what is dominant culturally may not necessarily be right in principle. That's just the reality. When we go to the books of Usul al-Fiqh, we don't find that. In Minhaj al-Baydawi, Imam al-Baydawi rahmatullahi alayhi, he said, يعني madhab al-ammi, madhab al-mufti, that the madhab of the common person that doesn't have knowledge is the madhab of the person that gives that person fatwa.
Mm.
So they bring it back to the scholar. You see what I'm saying? So, and even in the whole discussion of talfiq, of blending the madhab, this issue has come back that these things have been discussed in the books of usul al-fiqh and so on and so forth. Now, the real debate comes among the scholars themselves in terms of, can you make ijtihad? Can you go directly to the Quran and the Sunnah? And up to now, whether we like it, people have bent a lot on that because that there's too many new events, new issues that have come up,
Mhm.
right? So you can't just say that following that there's no necessity for research. There's necessity for research. There's necessity for coming up with new opinions. There's necessity for learning how to extract what they call takhrij from the positions of the scholars of the past and just build on them. There's all these different pathways, that we have. So that means we're in a good shape in that regard. We're not confused. It's just the average in terms of the scholarly circles. But the general masses, there's a lot of confusion. And part of it is those of us that are teaching. We teach in a very intolerant way. Our circles become circles. Firstly, we indirectly consider ourselves to be the imams, right? There's that quiet understanding that I am the leader. And then secondly, we teach intolerance and we don't contextualize in the proper way,
Hmm.
right? And some of that happens because of the translators, some of that happens because of the teachers, the attitudes, the way they talk, whatever. But we can. We have a community that is diverse.
We
So
just don't respect
if the
difference.
students don't
That's
have
what,
the knowledge, they have to learn how to respect the fact that there's other practices that are there, even if they disagree.
yeah, I feel like people don't respect each other's differences, and then it becomes an issue of where you bring up something as a difference of opinion. It's like belittled as or threatened as being an innovator.
Well, that was the problem when the Salafi Dawah, you know,
Right. But not only the Salafis are do that.
right. I know that, but that's where you got to realize that a lot of these people that now are following the madhab or claiming to follow the madhab, because as far as I'm concerned, a lot of that is just talk. It's just a bunch of talk, identity talk. They study one class and then all of a sudden they're, this school of thought or that school of thought. That doesn't work like that, and so it's like a lot of those brothers and some of those sisters, they were ex-Salafis.
Hmm.
And so they took in the rhetoric, or they were not, and they were inducted into it. They were brought into it with their mindset. No, that's not how we deal with the tradition, so to speak. That's why I gave that talk that it's about conceptualizing. يعني تصور المسائل is about conceptualizing the issues. In this case, المتعلقة بالصلاة. They are issues that relate to the salah. The This study here, we each section can be constituted as an issue in the salah. What is the obligation, right? And then even the discussion of how do we deal with the sunnah comes up. Like you can take it pretty far with the basic knowledge if you organize it properly, right? You can take it far from the angle of, why do we use the term sunnah as non-obligation, and then, well, we have terminology that we use, and terminology can have multiple meanings, and you can get into a discussion on that the obligations, are part of the sunnah too. You have hadith, you know, if you want to limit the sunnah in that sense, but you have a hadith that give us commands. And the Quran tells us, follow the messenger. And it's not an obligation in terms of Aqidah. I mean, it's not a recommendation, it's an obligation in terms of Aqidah and believing in the Prophet. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So then how do we follow his guidance? So then, we have to learn that his guidance consists of different types of actions. Some of them are obligations and some of them are not. How do you classify that? That's the argument that's made for the idea of the madhabs. I heard some of those arguments recently, but that doesn't mean, for instance, if you're using that to go against the Salafi dawah has 100 years in the mix, and they're drawing from the tradition as well, and they're drawing from Hadith and Quran as well. It's not something that's just a complete innovation as people claim. And so for the most part, you're gonna find that they have their books like to dismantle and say that the Hanbali school in Saudi Arabia is not real. That's BS.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? That's an ideological stance that just is not worth anything. Because if you're gonna make those types of claims, then you're gonna find yourself in a problem with other groups as well. But that's just not valid. They're very clear on what it is, how it is that they deal with the Hanbali madhab, right? And when you go deep and you see the curriculum studies, they're very clear. If it wasn't for the fact that they were around, the Hanbali madhab would be in serious distress and would pretty much be dead. In Al Azhar al Sharif, when I was in Egypt, they were not teaching Hanbali fiqh.
Mm.
Although Sheikh Abdul Hakim, who was the highest Qari in Isnad from my understanding at that time that I knew of, or one of the highest, I should say, he was Hanbali, and Dr. Muhammad Said, he became one of the spokespeople for the Hanbali school, and he eventually started teaching the Hanbali madhab, and they opened it back up. But at one period of time, all that four madhab talk, that's nonsense. In Al Azhar, they were not teaching the Hanbali school. They discontinued it.
Mm. So they were only recognizing three madhabs,
They were
or
saying four madhabs, but in practice, they were teaching three madhabs from the Sunnis, and then they would teach indirectly, but it wasn't specialized because you study fiqh in a general sense, so you're studying other opinions as well, and they have a systematic way of doing that. And then you declare a madhab, and so you focus on the study track as well in madhab studies in your own madhab. But they have a way of presenting fiqh that is a more contemporary style, and so you begin to learn about the other schools that exist. But they were not teaching it as a specialized fiqh, like that you sign up and you register as a Hanbali. Yeah, that
mm-hmm.
changed. That changed in today's time. That's the reality. And it was and the irony is that one of the easiest madhabs when it comes to economics is the Hanbali madhab by
Yeah, you
the
were saying that
declaration.
last week.
Huh?
You were saying that last week.
Yeah, it is one of the easiest madhabs in terms of economics. In terms of marriage, is one of the most beneficial for blocking divorce.
Mm.
And these are the things that people try to bring up. They try to say, like when it comes to some Hanbali positions or when it comes to some of the scholars within the circle of Hanabila, like for instance, the issue of three divorces being one, they try to say is a bid'ah. Well, the Shafi'is have the same opinion. So those who bring that type of stuff up is ideological, but that issue of the divorce, three being one, is incredibly beneficial in terms of beneficial to the family, the children, the woman. If you go with the idea of somebody saying three divorces in one sitting is three divorces, then you're basically saying that at that point in time, because of the whatever that mind state is of that person, that the family is destroyed.
Mm.
So somebody can come And even in the Hanbali school, the whole issue of talaq bil ighlaq, the mentioning the talaq and you being in a state of anger is not valid. The doing making the talaq and you're on your menses. The woman is on her menses. It's not valid because it's talaq bid'i. Where the other schools they say it's valid. You know what I'm saying? But in that type of thinking, they say no, it's not valid because it's bid'ah. So it has to be done according to the sunnah. So it's not, some of these things are not like people think, you know what I'm saying, in that regard. There's things that are to be disagreed with, you know, but some things are extremely beneficial. Like, is the whole is the whole body of the woman aura? That's that's like very difficult to claim that. But in the Hanbali school, that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So the whole issue of gloves and the issue of hijab or niqab comes in, as being an obligation. But in covering the feet, but those things are not, you know, it's not that easy to prove that. You know what I'm saying? But the other things are very beneficial due to preservation of the family and so on and so forth.
So as far as imposing one another's madhab on each other, like let's say you're Maliki and but you can't impose your madhab on
In
your
context of, and even though you didn't bring this up, but in the
Mhm.
context of government, in the context of husband, wife, those become issues.
Mhm.
So the general concept has been, in one place, like if you go to a place like Malaysia, where majority of the people are Shafi'i, even if the government takes the Shafi'i stance in terms of the court system, you're not going to feel that much because everybody's on the same approach. The same thing when you start talking about places like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and so on and so forth. But when you start going to more cosmopolitan places, like a place like Egypt that historically hasn't been one school, you know, it it starts to come out like, the Ottomans, they began to impose one madhab. They imposed all that talk about the four madhabs. They began to eliminate the other schools from the judiciary system and force
Mhm.
everybody to follow the Hanafi school. You know, and for a while, the Hanafi school was what was dominant in the court system when it came to family law in a place like Egypt. And then it changed and it became like more flexible, right? Because sometimes a fatwa, it can end in being oppressive to a person because it's not necessarily addressing their real needs. You're just imposing a ruling without المكلف. The hukam is متعلق بأفعال المكلفين. The hukam, the ruling, is tied to the actions of the person that's a mukallaf, the person that's culpable. But if you're not looking at the person, the human being and their needs, they're not good fiqh there. So on the political level, we found that was challenging. And and even crazy as it might sound, even someone like Sheikh Al-Albani, who was not necessarily a promoter of the madhab by any means,
Mhm.
he made the argument that if there was to be an Islamic government, that they would have to do comparative fiqh. They would not be able to just follow one school in total. When in Saudi Arabia, the court system follows mostly the Hanbali school, but not totally limited. But so everybody has flexibility in that regard. Now, husband and wife becomes complicated because husband and wife, in the government might have some things that they impose the method, but at the end of the day, they can't force you to follow one way. You have the freedom, and that's why for even in Saudi Arabia, you have al-ihsa, and in that place. you've always had multiple madhab, not just the
Mm.
Ahmadi school. So that's just an example of how you can have imposition but also freedom. And in the context of husband and wife, you know, I don't see I don't see what the necessity is to totally impose one thing on what salah, unless you're talking about inheritance, unless you're talking about certain other things that come about. Those things can be discussed and so on and so forth. But it's I don't. For me, the logic is difficult. I'm maybe not the best person to ask in that regard. Yeah, the imposing mentality, whether it's not only issues in fiqh, it's also in other issues as well. Like
Yeah.
in the family life, it becomes like how the house is cleaned, how the children are raised, and all that type of stuff.
Jazakallah. Yeah.
And reality is not always following the school. In reality, sometimes the question comes about as to follow what I say. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little different than following the madhab. It becomes follow what I say more so. Like I want absolute obedience.
Yeah. And I find that there's a lot of people like that hide behind religion to impose their own personal preference or understanding of the world and how things should be. But
Education
those
is
same
important.
people don't typically deal with masses because you would never be able to do that. You would never be able to work in a, as a public figure, as a teacher,
People
you wouldn't
do
be
it.
able to do
Like
that.
imams have that problem.
Yeah.
Imams have that problem, you know, because sometimes imams they just want it their way.
Hmm.
Right? That's one of the reasons why we have difficulty working together to accomplish anything
Yeah.
because the khutbah mentality becomes the mindset that people have for everything, and that doesn't work in a circle of knowledge. It doesn't work when you're dealing with other human beings. And the Quran even says, "Yani amarhum shura bainahum," that their affairs are uh, conducted or governed by mutual consultation. That includes marriage. That includes marriage in terms of that. And there has to be a certain degree of flexibility and freedom, but that requires also people to learn and study, you know. But the issue of a madhab becoming a problem in a relationship is a serious dilemma because then now what's happening is that instead of religious instruction being there to guide in the building of a family or the preservation of the family, it becomes the means by which people end in a bad place. Not only when it comes to husband and wife, but the same reality is in the case of children and how you raise the children, right? And the complexities of the world demand that people are considering the psychological well-being of the children. We can easily say that going to an amusement park is haram in the summertime because what you're going to end up seeing is people that are half clothed and so on and so forth. And then
Hmm.
we keep making that excuse on a number of different issues. And then we have these children that are dysfunctional and can't move or navigate in this society at all because everything is haram for them.
Right.
And and the fact that we're living in a society of mixed values, they don't know how to deal with that. And those are the types of discussions that nobody has because they're way too complicated. So our conceptualization of fun becomes an issue. And in the meantime, people are doing all kind of crazy things anyway.
Right.
But we're not thinking about how to groom these children in the right way. And this is the age. I was listening yesterday to a talk that was given recently by a speaker who has gained some traction. Imam Sheikh. Um, but he was talking about a particular sister. This has nothing to do with the U.S. This has to do with overseas.
Mm.
He was talking about a particular sister, and he was talking about how um he was talking about the whole feminist thing, and he brought up the feminist thing. And that he brought up that she was making the argument that a lot of fiqh is just focus on men and so on and so forth. And I was like, you can't completely dismiss every argument on the grounds that okay, this may be associated with feminism.
Mm.
The question becomes, this is way, we kind of went way beyond where we needed to be, but the question really becomes, what is in the best interest of people? And if it is the case that there's a problem with the role of women in the community, how do you address it? We can't keep hiding behind, uh, you know, the non-Muslims. They talk about that. Well, that's why last week, I think, was it last week or I don't know if it was in this group or in another group, I brought up the whole issue of Nana Asma. Oh no, it was in another session. It was with someone else. Nana Asma, Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi's daughter, she gained prominence. And so, for instance, when you look at the book, The African Caliphate, a strong section of the dawah is just the plight of women,
Mm.
right? And so this is why the whole issue of women taking over their own education starts becoming, something that people push for because when you start having that mindset of you don't exist, you know what I'm saying? It's all about obedience to me. You know what I'm saying? In the 21st century, that's just not cutting it out. It's not cutting it. And the opposite is true. The opposite extreme, it is a problem. The whole issue of some of the directions that feminism goes in, it is a problem, but the world is it, that's why I say traditional orientations can bring problems.
Yeah.
Traditional marriage in today's economy and time period is problematic on some fronts. On other fronts, it's beneficial because it gives clarity of roles. But the reality of the situation is that, the traditional marriage may not be able to survive the blows of what happens in society, like in the case of unemployment, you know, or in the case of underemployment. Those things, those things create imbalances in the relationship. And that's why the default position comes back to the issue of shura. You know, the default position comes back to the issue of shura. The shura is that which helps even it out. And even in that case, you know, is very difficult because I've seen couples that I thought were stable that had a traditional setup end in a really bad place over who makes the decisions in the marriage. And strong personalities come out, in terms of dominance. You know, it could be the case that the woman is dominant, then the man is trying to assert himself, and then it just becomes chaos over who's the leader because at the end, everybody's competing for power. That's the problem that we have in today's time. And that's why I say, like, the issue of short or mutual consultation, be easygoing as much as possible, because when you look at psychological orientation and you look at, you know, people bringing in religion, it doesn't go to a good place sometimes.
Yeah.
Majori Green, I was reading about her life last night, and there's not much out there. She's kind of like a discreet person, but she's divorced. So I started thinking, like, she's right wing, conservative, far right, they call her, and they claim to be people of family values, this, that, whatever. So what happened there? You know what I'm saying? So we're seeing the signs all over the place of breakdown. So Fiqh shouldn't be made, point of breakdown. That's the that's the takeaway.
Yeah, it shouldn't. I mean, it's not the same as a counseling session that a couple might need to work through their issues because it's not gonna suffice to say, well, this is the rule, this is what you have to follow. Like it doesn't work as far as marriage counseling, I don't think.
والاجتهاد لا ينقض الاجتهاد. So one madhab doesn't, get to dominate another madhab. The reality is that the decisions made on certain issues should be decisions that are made in the context of what is within the best interest of people, and those are decisions that have to be somewhat discussed, or there has to be some sort of understanding of what's within the well-being of others.